So the saga of Moses continues. We are just on the other side. We've skipped a couple of chapters, you may have noticed. And really what we skipped were the chapters between Moses and God arguing back and forth with each other, right? As we talked about last week, that took a little while. It took a little while for God to convince Moses to go and do this thing, that Moses was the person that needed to go. And Moses goes kind of begrudgingly. First he goes to his father-in-law, whose house he lives in, and he asks his father-in-law for permission to go. And you can kind of be like, I'm hoping, you can see in the back of his head, it's like, well, hopefully he says no. But he doesn't, so he says, sure, go. So he goes. And then he meets his brother Aaron, who God was going to put these two together. And they go off and they go to Pharaoh. And they go to Pharaoh not with a request yet to let people leave. Not the request yet to say, hey, we're just going to take off. But with a smaller request from the beginning. And the smaller request from the beginning is just let the people go for 3 days to this mountain to worship God, right? And so basically, can we just have a little bit of a break here? Like just a long weekend. Come on, Pharaoh, can we have a long weekend? Is the request that Moses makes. And I'm sure in his mind, he's like, well, this is a fairly reasonable thing to do, right? And we all do this, right? We can all decide in our brains why it's obvious they should say yes, right? Like, we're very good at this. So Moses is like, this is obviously a reasonable request. And God was thinking ahead, and in case Pharaoh wasn't immediately won over to this idea, God actually helped Moses and gave him some magic tricks to perform. There's this whole exchange where he's like, what's that rod in your hand? What's that in your hand? And Moses is like, it's a rod. And I'm like, and God's like, it's a snake. And it is a snake. And oh my gosh. And so Moses comes and he talks to the Israelites. Now remember, they don't know who he is, right? They know who Aaron is. Aaron's been around. They don't know who Moses is. Moses has been gone for a long time, right? He was probably a teenager when he left. He's much older now. He's married. And even before that, remember, Moses didn't grow up with the Hebrew people. He grew up as an Egyptian. So, here comes this guy wandering out of the desert with a rod that turns into a snake. And it's like, hey, I got a great idea. Let's ask Moses or Pharaoh for a long weekend so we can go over here and worship God. And then, of course, the Israelites respond, who's this God you're talking about? We don't know that person. And then Moses explains, and they're like, okay, that sounds good. You go ask Pharaoh. So Moses goes and he asks Pharaoh, and predictably, Pharaoh does what? Pharaoh's like, of course, that sounds very reasonable. Go ahead. No! That is not what he does, right? At this point, the Hebrew people have been enslaved in Egypt for generations, right? The entire Egyptian economy is based on their labor, right? You don't get to build pyramids and all this other stuff that they build unless you got a bunch of people who are willing to work for basically nothing. Right? And so Pharaoh can kind of smell what's up. He's not an idiot. He's like, well, if I let you go for this, are you going to come back? I'm sure he's thinking to himself, I don't think I would come back. Right? And so, of course, Pharaoh says no. He says, not only can you not go, if you think you have all this extra time to take some days off and go into the wilderness to pray, then obviously you need more work to do, right? And so we're going to give you more work to do. You have to make the same number of bricks, but you now have to go get your own straw. We're not going to provide that anymore. But you got to do the same amount of work. So that's where we pick up the story now, and the supervisors, the Israelite supervisors, these are Hebrew people, from the Hebrew people, but they're the supervisors of all the stuff, go to Pharaoh, and if you look carefully at what they say, hey, Pharaoh, why are you mistreating your people? And I'm like, well, no, wait a minute. Who do the Hebrews belong to? Do they belong to God? Do they belong to Pharaoh? Are they confused? I think they're confused. right? They don't know who they belong to anymore. It's been that long, right? And so, so the Israelite supervisors are like, oh, wait a minute, this guy wandered out of the desert, convinced us to maybe go on a little vacation, and now we have to do all this extra work. So they, of course, go to Moses and Aaron and saying, hey, guys, what's up? WTF, right? If they could text, that's what they would text to each other, right? You promised us this stuff. You said you were going to help us out here, and Nick, you just made things worse, right? And so Moses and Aaron go, oh my gosh, what do we do? And so of course they turn around and they go to God, and they're like, God, what's going on? And the Israelites like, who is this crazy man who came out of the desert and asked us to do this insane thing? Obviously, this is not going to work out well. And it starts to, and so this is where the story begins. And of course, we know where it goes, right? Like if you keep reading, the next chapter is the plagues, and then eventually they do kind of get let loose, and then they kind of run, and we'll get there. Like we know where the story goes, but this is where it begins, right? It wasn't just the decision that Pharaoh had to make standing in front of God, or Moses had to make standing in front of God saying, okay, I will do what you asked me to. But now Moses has to decide again because it's not easy. Turns out that what we're trying to do here is really hard, and it's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of sacrifice. And so, is this really what we're supposed to be doing? Why is this crazy man asking us to do this crazy thing, right? But oftentimes, most of the time in life, the things that are most worth doing start off being a lot harder before they get easier. Now, June and July, this summer has been really fun for a lot of reasons. And one of the reasons it's been fun, especially for me, as a kid who grew up desperately wanting to and never being able to go to space camp. I know you're surprised that I wanted to go to space camp. We had a great anniversary this summer, which of course was the 50th anniversary of the moon landings. And of course, how does that start? Well, it turns out about 60 years ago, another crazy man stood in front of a group of people and asked them to do a crazy thing, right? In 1991, JFK said, hey, we're going to go to the moon. Right, and I'd grown up with this mythology, and I'd known about it, we'd all heard the clip from the speech, growing up, and of course we know the end of the story. We know that we got there, but what's been really fascinating with the anniversary is to kind of watch. PBS has this amazing 6-hour-long documentary about the Apollo missions, from this moment and forward and going to the moon. And you should find 6 hours and watch it. It is inspiring. But what I don't know that I ever really realized until I watched it was how far behind and how minuscule the space program was at the time JFK said this. Like, we couldn't even get things into orbit when he said this, let alone onto another planet. Like, this was insane. Most of our rockets were actually doing this. I think we got a picture. Is that the next picture? Yeah, most of them were doing this. Most of the stuff that we were building was blowing up. There was one that was really, it was one that was so flimsy that it literally, there was a small failure, and then it like folded itself in half on the launch pad and then exploded, right? And so this was our space program, right? And Jay says, we're gonna go to the moon. I'm like, sure, crazy guy. And so there were all of these years, there was all these technical challenges to overcome, all these things to be done, this really, really hard work. It was costing a lot of money, and it was costing a lot of time. And then eventually, though, it started to cost even more when we got to Apollo 1. So Apollo 1 was the first time, I think we got a picture. Apollo 1 was the first time we actually lost astronauts. And we lost astronauts at Apollo 1, and people had to sit around and ask, like, oh gosh, is this really worth it? Is this really worth doing? I mean, look what it is costing us to be part of this process. Look what this goal is costing us to do. Like, do we want to be, like, is this worth the effort? Look how hard this is. And people declared after the Apollo 1 disaster that there was no way by the end of the decade we were going to make it. There was absolutely no way we were going to get there. Now, of course, the program shut down and they had to retool and they had to do all this stuff. But eventually, the decision is made again. So we made decisions at the beginning to kind of follow with what the president set out for us. Then we made a decision to start building some rockets, and we keep making decisions, and we keep making decisions. And after Apollo 1, the decision was made to say, no, we want to keep going. And the ones leading the charge for keep going were the astronauts who were going to go, who just saw their friends perish. But they were the ones that were most out front saying, no, we have to keep doing this. We can make it. And of course, we know the story goes on. And after Apollo 1, there's Apollo 2 and Apollo 3 and Apollo 4. And eventually there's Apollo 8. And Apollo 8 is the first mission to actually circle the moon. And what's interesting is this picture went on to be named like one of the top 100 pictures in the 20th century. It was on every newspaper. It was everywhere for a long time. It was on a postage stamp. You know you've made it when you're on a postage stamp. And it is because it is the first time that we had ever seen Earth from this perspective. And what's interesting is this photo was actually a complete mistake. In that, they had, the astronauts, if you don't know this, the astronauts' life is incredibly regulated. There are people on the ground, right, who would make the naggiest mother look permissive, right? Like, if you are an astronaut, you are scheduled to the ground, and there are people on the ground, multiple jobs, whose job it is to tell you, it's like, all right, for the next 3 minutes, you're going to do this, and for the next 4 minutes, you're going to do this. And there was this whole list of pictures that they were supposed to get as they were circling the moon. And when they were coming around the moon, one of the astronauts looked up out the window and saw this. This picture was not on their list of pictures to take. Yeah. Learn that. Thank you, PBS. All right. Viewers like you. All right. But it wasn't on. But he looked at us and was like, "Oh my gosh, we have to get this picture." And so they scramble real fast, and scrambling in zero gravity is quite the thing, I'm sure. And they get the camera and they get it all set up, and they take what is probably one of the most influential pictures on the face of the planet. Now, this is the same crew. They would actually be up there during Christmas, and they were supposed to give a Christmas Eve greeting from lunar orbit, right? And they were the first people to ever do this. And they're like, okay. And the astronauts went to the officials at NASA, and they said, what do we say? And they're like, something good. Really, that was I think it was maybe profound or something, you're going to, basically, the entire world will be listening. More people will be listening to this radio broadcast that have ever listened to any radio broadcast on history. You should probably say something worthwhile. Okay? And of course, these are astronauts, right? You don't get up there because you're profound, right? You get up there because you're willing to do stupid things in airplanes, right? That's how you get up there. And so if you listen to this broadcast, or some of you were probably around for this, you know what they did. They read Genesis chapter 1. Actually, one of their wives recommended it before they left. So they brought up a copy of Genesis chapter 1, where God creates the world and calls it good. Because how can you look at that view, that little blue smudge amongst all the blackness, and say, God created something good, right? And so from the moon circling around, they talked about how God separated the light and the dark, the waters from the land, how God did all of these things and called it good. And so when we think about why did we spend the time and the energy and the money and all that stuff to get up there? I think it's for a couple of reasons, and one of them I think is that picture. Because we need to remind ourselves that God created something and did something good. And oftentimes when I look at, people think of different things when we look at the flag. When I look at the flag, people think of different things. This is the flag that I think of. There are 6 of those up there, put there by human hands on a world other than this one. Look what we can do when we're willing to do the hard things. look what we can do when we're willing to say yes to the crazy man. Look what we can do when we're not deterred. We can put our flag hundreds of thousands of miles away on another planet. Now, most of us aren't going to be asked to do this. Only a handful of people got to do this. Some of those poor schmoes had to stay in the one like that circled the moon while everyone else went down. It's really interesting to listen to their interviews. But there are times all of us in life will be asked to do hard things. So earlier this summer, I and several people in this church were asked to do something that at the time felt fairly preposterous. So who here was on our Belize trip? Right? Hold on. Nope, not there. So, okay. Who was here on the Belize trip? There's a few. All right, in the back. So we went to Belize earlier this year, in the summer, and one of the things we were going to do was to build a house. That was our job. We were going to build a house for somebody who needed one, which is great. And I'm like, I've been on Habitat trips, right? Like, I've been in Habitat, right? You get together, you build some walls and stuff, and, like, that'll be great. Like, it'll be fun. We can build a house. I've been part of this. Like, I'm not particularly handy. In this way, but I'm sure there's people around who know what they're doing. How hard could it be, right? Famous last words. Because this is not what ours looked like. I think the next picture is, this is where we rolled up. And they're like, you're going to build a house there. And I'm like, you're a crazy man. How on earth is that supposed to work? So this was the first day that we got there, and we looked at the property. And then conveniently, while we were gone and we came back the next day, somebody had dropped off a whole bunch of rocks and dirt. So now it turns out this was actually fairly important for the process because, that's basically what we had to work with. And so you obviously don't want to build a house like down in the marsh. You want to build it above it. So you're going to build it on posts. So that was a big part of our job. I think we've got a picture here, was helping to set all of these posts in the muck and in the grime. And I was never so glad that I didn't bring rubber boots and that the hills did. Because it meant the hills were the ones that got to be out there in the grime, digging posts, like nutty nut jobs that they were. All right. And so this is like what we did. And so you're just like, okay. And if you haven't noticed this is a special kind of wood. Ask Alan about it. He knows. That comes from the area that they use for this kind of stuff. And it literally probably weighs a metric ton. Like, these things are insanely heavy and insanely dense because that's what you want. Right? And so, and so we're like, okay, we took, let's set some posts. So we set some posts and we did that. And then, again, I think the next picture, see, look, they brought boots. How smart or dumb were they? And then of course you got to cut all these crazy things off to the right length so you can do things the right way. We do that. And then there was all of this rock and all of this dirt. And the purpose of all the big chunk of rock was to basically bring up the elevation of the ground, so that we weren't walking in this muck and in this gook. And by the time we were done, this is what it looked like. Now, go back. You're fast on the button, dear. All right. This is what it looked like. Now, in the U.S., you would go to the tool rental place and rent some small machine that would allow you to pull, move all the dirt around, right? That's how you would do it. Well, this is not the U.S. By any means. This is a whole other place, and that's not an option. So how do you do it? How did we do it? Buckets, right? Gavin, how did we do it? Buckets. How do you do the hard thing? You do the hard thing one bucket at a time. And that's what we did. Everybody loved it when we shouted, bucket time, ran away.
But all of the dirt that came and filled in that area, all of the rocks, all of the cement that was mixed and then hauled to make the pillars, all of that, the power of people, one bucket at a time. And so that by the time we left, we not only had ground, we had not only solid ground underneath, we had a platform, and we had walls going in. And then a crew that actually knew what they were doing, a professional crew that was volunteering on the island, was going to come and actually build the rest of it, which is probably a good idea. We want walls to be straight and electricity to be, where it's supposed to be. You don't want electricity where it's not supposed to be. Let me just say that. So I actually texted to try to get some pictures of the progress, but I haven't gotten any pictures yet, so I'll have to get some of those. But so by the time, we left, let's go, next picture I think is, so this is Daisy. Daisy's the mom of all of the kids who will have this house down the road. And I kind of wonder what maybe she thought when this group of, 11 teenagers and 9 adults rolled up, looked at her backyard, and said, "We're here to build you a house." I wonder if she thought we were crazy. Because I kind of thought we were crazy. It was hard. I've been on many, many mission trips. I have literally never worked that hard and never come home that bruised as I came home from this trip. Sometimes God asks us to do hard things. Just because something gets hard doesn't mean we're doing the wrong thing. Oftentimes, it means we're doing the right thing. Because God isn't afraid to ask us to do hard things. And the way that we get there is one bucket at a time, one trip to the gym at a time, one day at a time, one treatment at a time, one conversation at a time, one hug at a time, one mean word not said at a time, one step at a time. That's how the Israelites will get to freedom. It won't happen overnight, and it won't happen by magic, and there'll be twists and there'll be turns, and there will be hardships along the way. But they know that they are going somewhere God has put for them to go. So one step at a time, we know that they will get there. God asks us to do hard things as individuals, as families, and at a church. God also has faith, asks us to have faith that He'll be with us even when it's not going well. And that all God asks, all that crazy man asks, is that we move forward. One bucket, one step at a time.